It is time for the Awesemo NASCAR Live Before Lock shows. We're here to get you ready for today's Daytona 500. Of course, I am Jason Floyd. We are sponsored by Prize Picks. Later on in the show, we'll talk about some Prize Picks plays that the guys here have looked at and said that they really like. Some laps led, that one that definitely has stuck out to both of them. And of course, over Prize Picks, you got to hit those Prize Picks props a little earlier on the week because that's where you're going to get the best number out there. Of course, if you got any questions for the guys, be sure to line those up over in the chat, whether that's here in YouTube, also in our Discord chat. I got that up here on the screen, so I'll see those questions as they do come in. Of course, if you throw a super chat in there, question goes right to the top of the queue. But of course, I am here joined by the gurus of NASCAR DFS, Chris and Phil. Guys, great to be here on a Sunday afternoon talking to you about today's NASCAR DFS Daytona 500. But we do have a little bit of news, some drivers going to the rear. Pass through for Harvick. Let's first off start there because there's going to be a lot of people. This may be their first time playing NASCAR DFS because of the Millionaire Contest over on DraftKings. Explain what is happening with him.
Okay,
so,
yeah.
Go ahead, Phil.
Okay. If this were just a normal, failed inspection once or failed inspection twice, then this is no big deal. They're going to the tail end of the lead lap, and we're not worrying about this. But because Harvick failed inspection 3 times, he has to serve a pass-through penalty, which means when everybody else is taking the green flag and going across the start-finish line, Harvick is going to have to dart off and go through pit lane. So what this is automatically going to do is it's going to cause him to lose the draft. He is going to be a lone duck out there by himself pushing through that dirty air while the rest of the field is half a raceway away from him, and they're going to be picking up speed. He's going to be the slowest car most likely in the field. And the worry is that before we have a potential wreck that moves Harvick back to the field, or we get to the end of the first segment break, that the field catches up to Harvick, puts him a lap down, and this happens early enough that by the end of that first segment break, that Harvick is no longer the first car a lap down, and he doesn't get the lucky dog. And then we're repeating this cycle of hoping for another caution so that Harvick can get his lap back. So it really does put Harvick at a big disadvantage just in terms of actual racing today.
Chris, did you have any more thoughts you wanted to throw on that? I guess maybe the thought is, okay, so whatever your exposure was before the multiple tech failures that he had here, how does that change your thought process of how much you want to get to him?
Yeah, so me and Phil were both talking about that in the pre-show. We both did drop our exposure a little bit because there is a much more added risk now with Daniel Harvick, and you don't want to get stuck with the lame duck at the very beginning of the race, because if we don't have any wrecks and carnage early on and other cars get put lap down, you could be in a real tough spot with Daniel Harvick, who was once a very, very good play. He was in my cash game shell build pretty much since as soon as the starting order came out. I've since took him out of my cash game build, and I have dropped his ownership a bit. I was sitting around 25-ish%, which is what I thought the field would come in close to. And I've now dropped that around 10%, like 10 to 15% around so.
And also should be noted, drivers going to the rear, Logano for a backup car, Villanueva for an engine. Of course, we mentioned about Harvick there. He failed 3 times. The 4th time, he finally did pass inspection. The other one is Chase Briscoe, who failed 2 times. So I know anyone who watched yesterday's strategy show, you guys talked about, we're talking about those drivers who are starting, 1 to 20. This is, as Phil kind of joked about the password that we all know is stack to back in terms of this one. But as you look at Logano, you look at Chase Briscoe now going to the back of field. I know, Chris, right before the show, you were looking at Logano and saying, maybe this actually helps him. Yeah,
for sure. Like when someone goes to the rear at a super speedway race, it's not like a normal track where it's a lot harder to get back to the front. I mean, these guys drop to the back of the pack. They can get themselves right back to the front within a matter of laps. I mean, and a guy like Joey Logano, he knows how to work his way through the field of super speedway. So I have no concerns about that whatsoever. Chase Briscoe, same can be said for him. I wasn't really a big fan of Briscoe anyway with the starting position, but don't let a guy go into the rear of the field at a track like this. Sway your thoughts on him.
Of course, you mentioned about that DraftKings contest with the millionaire. Phil, let me go to you. Approach on that contest today of how you're developing your lines for the millionaire contest.
Right. We talk ad nauseum about just like simple GPP strategy when it comes to these super speedway events. It's the, quote unquote, stack the back. And then if you're feeling adventurous enough, you start looking a little bit further up that starting grid into drivers into the teens that you hope can get you a top 5 finish. And if you're feeling crazy and you're looking at drivers that are starting in the top 10, then these are guys that absolutely have to lead laps and get you that top 5, that top 3 finish. Well, when we're trying to find differentiation among 106,000 entries in this case, that's when you have to start thinking really outside of the box. And like one of the simplest ways is we've got a bunch of guys in this back half of the field that are just as valuable as anybody else, but are going to be seeing minimal ownership simply because these aren't household names. Like if you want a simple way to think about ownership when it comes to these super speedway events, it's people scanning 21st through 40th. They're looking for names that they recognize. And if it's a bigger name and a bigger team, then ownership tends to find their way towards these guys. So when we have a situation with a guy like Jacques Villeneuve or Kaz Grala that some people might know, Greg Biffle, people that have been watching the sport for a while, they remember that name. Different guys like this that people are going to be a little bit hesitant to play. These are guys that probably should be making our player pool just in case they survive enough carnage and they do what it takes to get into the top 10.
Of course, I appreciate Sean in the super chat. So as I mentioned, you get that super chat in there, you'll go to the top of the queue. Sean saying, guys, talk me out of Cole Custer. Is there a pivot or is he himself a pivot?
So unfortunately for me, because I'm right there with him, I am not a big fan of ever rostering Cole Custer. It hardly ever works out for me, but he has now made his way into my cash game build with the news of Daniel Hemrick going to the rear. I just feel like he's not to the rear, it's the pass-through penalty. So I feel like he's a much safer play than Hemrick at this point. But the thing with Custer is, just as everybody else, if he can just avoid wrecks, he has top 20 upside, top 15 upside, starting in 31st. His price point's cheap. He is one of the best plays down low, as a portion as it is.
Phill, what's your thoughts on Cole Custer?
Before the really kind of before today, Hemrick was not Hemrick. God, I'm still focused and tilting off of that. Custer was a guy that wasn't exactly somebody that I was making a concerted effort to get to, but because of this stinking Hemrick news, now it almost feels like I have to default to Custer. Like he's just the most natural pivot. And the thing that people will look at is like if you're looking at stats for Custer, his history in super speedway races, it hasn't been that fantastic, and that will probably keep the majority of people off of him. But Lord, I mean, in these events, like you almost have to have a blind eye when it comes to bad history, because yeah, sure enough, a driver can wreck out in 4, 5, 6 of these races, but all it takes is one. And if you've got, a dabble of a driver like Custer in the race that he decides to not get crazy and finally finish in the top 10 from a 30 starting position, you're going to be loving it. You're going to say, okay, finally it worked out.
Of course, this is the Awesemo NASCAR Live Before Lock show. Of course, be sure we got about 450 people in here. Be sure to hit that thumbs up, subscribe to Awesemo right here on YouTube. Got a ton of great shows for you each and every day. Of course, coming up here later today, we got NBA Deeper Dive at 6 o'clock Eastern time. So stay tuned here. Of course, we'll be here until 2:30 p.m. Eastern time talking today's Daytona 500. Now, when we talk about roster construction, guys, let's just go to Chalk City, because we all know who the chalk is today. I mean, we joke about, stack the back, but obviously the two guys that everyone's going to be looking at is the man starting in 30th, Denny Hamlin, the man starting in 36, Austin Dillon. So, I guess really the question here is like, whether you're playing in a 3 max, 20 max, 150 max, single entry, like how do you kind of adjust what you do here with these two guys in Chalk City?
So it's going to depend on it's going to depend on your risk tolerance, really. Because if you're playing a single entry, not having Hamlin in your lineup is going to be terrifying, because he is going to be extremely high owned. If we're talking single entries, there's a decent chance he can push for 60+% ownership. Just by simply not clicking on his name and getting a guy with similar upside, or there's actually several drivers like Joey Logano, William Byron, Kevin Harvick, who are going to be at over like less than half the ownership of Denny Hamlin. If you just completely skip over Hamlin, you can start to get more chalky with your lineup because you're leaving off a guy that everyone's going to have. And anybody and everybody here has an equal chance of wrecking. Hamlin is not bulletproof. He can easily get caught up in a wreck. It might not be his fault. Ricky Stenhouse might turn somebody or Logano and it just gets collected in there. So honestly, if you were one that really wants to try to shoot for the top of the leaderboard and you don't want to just min cash on a single entry, just leaving off Hamlin or just leaving off one of those chalky mid-range drivers and just getting a couple pivots in there, it's definitely a great way to go about that.
Mentioned a question that we just got Discord, and I think there's people who are playing, whether we're talking about DraftKings or FanDuel, and Chris, I know yesterday you talked about some of the groups that you're creating in terms of fantasy cruncher optimization based on where that driver is starting. You talked about the 3 tiers that you had, and one of the questions was how drastically different are your FanDuel groups versus your DraftKings groups?
So FanDuel, you can start to maybe like click more towards the beginning of the field, because I know in FanDuel, the place differential is not as important. It's kind of more so in finishing position. So I'd be more inclined to maybe kind of click on Chase Elliott's name a little bit more than I would on DraftKings, a little bit more of Ryan Blaney, more Joey Logano, Kevin Harvick, William Byron kind of guys, and maybe gravitate a little bit away from the absolute scrubs in the back, just because finishing position is weighted a little bit more heavy compared to place differential.
When we're talking about these drivers that are, 10K and above, over on DraftKings, and you look at, obviously Kyle Larson starting on the pole. I know you guys kind of talked about that yesterday of, you just don't want to get to Kyle Larson today because of where he is. You got Chase Elliott, mentioned Denny Hamlin, Ryan Blaney, which even though he is starting in the top 10, starting 7th, I know both of you guys sit there and like him in this spot. Phill, let me just kind of start with you about your take on Ryan Blaney today.
Yeah. The Fords are running peculiarly strong this weekend here at Daytona. And there was some garage chatter that out of all 3 car makes, that the Fords have possibly figured out the Gen 7 car just a little bit earlier than the Chevys and the Toyotas. Mm-hmm. And I mean, take what you will from these practice numbers. And of course, I believe it was a Ford that, it was Fords that swept the duels. I think it was a Ford that won the trucks race. And if you're saying, well, a Ford didn't win the Xfinity race, look how many Fords there are in the Xfinity series versus Chevys. That series should basically be called the Chevy Invitational. I think like 75% of the field runs a Chevy in that series. But, the Fords are running strong. Blaney has an impeccable super speedway record. Like I think he's a little bit better at Talladega than he is at Daytona, but still in his last 4 races here at Daytona, he's got a win in the summer race and then two other top 6 finishes. He's running really strong. Plus, he's got the added narrative, and believe me, the racing gods love nothing more than a good narrative at Daytona 500. Then it's his boss's birthday. Today is Penske's birthday, and if the racing gods are in a good enough mood, I mean that it may not sell you, but it's selling me to put a few shares of Blaney in my 150 max lineups.
Of course, if you got any questions for the guys, line those up in chats. Chris, will go over to you. I know you're Team Blaney. We know that, but what's kind of your take on him? And obviously he's starting 7th, so it's not a situation where he's starting 20th or later in the field. But what do you want to do with your exposure for Ryan Blaney today?
Yeah, I definitely don't need Swade much to play more Ryan Blaney, and I think Phill just did that with the birthday thing. I did not know that, so I might just up my exposure a little bit just because of that. But Blaney's one of those guys. Yes, he is very risky starting inside the top 10, but I mean, there's always outliers, and some guys can't sneak into the optimal lineup, and guys that can get up front, lead laps, and win the race are the guys that can do that. And Ryan Blaney with Team Penske, a team that typically runs near the front, like Phill said, the Fords have been pretty strong, and Penske tends to run these kind of tracks. So I can get behind Ryan Blaney for sure. Again, very risky, would not touch him in cash games, single entries. You're pushing it. But if you're building multiple lineups, Blaney's one of those guys I want to get to in the top 10.
Appreciate the super chat from Doans89. He says Byron and Gillard or Dillon and Gralla in the Millie.
I'm going to go with the Byron, and I believe you meant to say Gillen. Probably.
Guessing that's what it was.
Yeah, it's going to be lower owned. So if you want to take a shot at the Millie, I would roll with that one.
I mean, that's the thing about the, when you're talking about so many entries, I think it depends on, for me and those type of contest guys, it's about how many lineups am I putting in that, are you surely maxing out at 150, or maybe do you only have 5 lineups, and how you kind of figure out what you want to do, because, it's like, it doesn't matter what we're talking about NASCAR or any of your sports. Like, how do I differentiate myself from the field?
Right. And if you are someone that's you're not maxing and you're only putting in several lineups, you're going to have to take some wild shots, because you're not going to have many opportunities to hedge yourself, and you're not going to want to chop it up with 100 people up top. You want to, try to get that single bullet that takes it down with nobody sharing, no holding hands. So just like I said, you don't have to go completely rogue. I talked about that with Phill yesterday on the strategy show, where some people try to get way too contrarian and you just end up making bad lineups. Having a good mix of good chalky plays is fine, but you got to make sure you pivot off that the lower you get into your lineup.
Guys, I kind of feel like if you truly want to get extremely contrarian, and I don't think you could recommend this, but getting away from Denny Hamlin would really help you. And then at that point, then you're just hoping for chaos.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, just simply not having Hamlin in your lineup, you're going to get different than over half the field, most likely. And that's huge leverage if anything happens to him. And this is the kind of track to get leverage on these huge chalk plays.
As I look at the mid-tier salary, throughout here, so let's just say anywhere from 7 and into the 9K range. Obviously, you have some drivers that you're going to be looking at because of place differential, particularly when we're talking on DraftKings. But there's a guy like Alex Bowman starting second, kind of a similar situation as Kyle Larson.
Yeah, I personally am viewing Alex Bowman as nearly the same exact play as Kyle Larson, where I just cannot touch these guys in 150 max builds. First thing I did, I X'd out Larson, I X'd out Bowman, and I feel pretty comfortable with that. The only way they can make the optimal lineup is if they lead a large chunk of this race, and they're going to both have to win. And even then, that's not a guarantee they still make the optimal, because we've seen in instances in the past where if a guy starts in the pole or near the very front, wins the race, they're still not in the optimal lineup at the end of the day.
What's your thoughts, Phill?
Yeah, Bowman and Larson, they've got it really tough, because when you look at who's starting 3rd through 9th, it's all Fords. I mean, it's just the Fords got aggressive at the end of both of those duels. They were able to basically sweep like 1st through 4th and 1st through 5th in those duels. And now it really, like, it's so tough, because, if we had this kind of weird scenario where Larson started on the pole and then Bowman started 3rd, where they could line up together, they could possibly create this early train, and just, Larson could lead like the first segment and nobody would bat their eyes at it, because, we're kind of expecting people to take it easy as we actually have like real racing conditions in these new cars. But with just rows of Fords behind both of these guys, like, there is nothing to stop Brad or Cindric or Blaney or really any of these other Fords from jumping out of line, and then the rest of the Fords just kind of follow suit and go on past them. So like Chris said, you need lap sled points from Bowman, and I think both Bowman and Larson are just set up in a really tough situation to try to capitalize on that, just because they don't have any immediate help up there from fellow Chevys or fellow Hendricks drivers.
And of course, today is the last day of our green flag promo. If you've not taken advantage of the promo we got going on for a season-long Awesemo Plus NASCAR package, you got to take advantage of this today. Use the promo code GREENFLAG. It's a full year of Awesemo Plus NASCAR for just $70. That's less than $2 per cup race this season. Of course, this gives you access to driver projections, ownership projections, top drivers tool to give you that edge you need in NASCAR DFS. Once again, use promo code GREENFLAG at checkout. This offer does expire today, so be sure to take advantage of that. That top driver tool is a key component of how I'm developing my lineups. And of course, here's how it works for me is once I get done with the show, I'll finalize my lines based on what Chris and Phill have said on the show. That's kind of how I put my lineups together. Just being honest with you, that's how I put my lineups there together. As we talk about these drivers kind of in that mid-tier range, there's we all know about a guy that has various nicknames. Spinhouse tends to be one of these nicknames that gets thrown out there about Ricky Stenhouse Jr. starting 18th, 7,900 on DraftKings, 7,500 over on FanDuel. And Freddie P over on chat says, if you're new to NASCAR, Fade Stenhouse, he's an aggressive driver that'll cost you the big wreck today.
And while that may be the case, some of the times he's the one wrecking everybody and he can stay clean. I actually do like Stenhouse a lot in tournaments today. I wrote him up in the Awesemo article. And I'm not saying he's a safe play. If you're rostering Stenhouse, you should expect him to completely kill your lineups. But the chance that he doesn't, he's actually a very good plate racer. He has one of the best average running positions in the field here at Daytona. He does have legit race winning potential. Like, he is an aggressive driver that can get up to the front, lead laps, and actually be a contender. Now, a lot of the times at Daytona, he tends to run into issues and wreck out. He's a lot better at Talladega at grabbing good finishes, but I was telling Phill yesterday in the strategy show that Stenhouse is the stereotypical tournament play here. He's an aggressive driver, starting mid-pack where no one wants to roster the guy. $8,000, the price really matters, but it's kind of up there for Stenhouse. And he's a guy that has very big swings in terms of how he finishes. So while he is scary, I think he's a good tournament play.
Phill, what is your take on Stenhouse today?
Yeah, I mean, Stenhouse, like if you're doing 20 max, or even if you're doing 150 max, but you don't want to take on that much risk, then I don't think you're including Stenhouse in your lineups, because he does carry that uncertainty where he's looking for a checkered flag, and sometimes he finds it on the lead lap, and unfortunately in some of these past super speedway races, he sees the checkered flag from pit road because he's already wrecked out. Ricky really is just about like how much risk are you willing to take on, because he can lose more positions than he can gain. You look at his outright odds, it mirrors guys similarly like Austin Dillon and Eric Almirola, guys that we're expecting to be much more chalkier plays because of the place differential upside. But could Ricky get you a top 5 and potentially be a top 6 score? Yes, it's definitely within the realm of possibilities, but it also seems like it's just as high that something happens in the final segment and Ricky's finishing 33rd, and now you've got this driver that's dragging down your lineups with negative points.
As you look at the salary range of the 7 and 8K drivers here, is there someone? I mean, obviously Eric Almirola is going to be a name that sticks out there, but look, a lot of people are going to be looking at with him, starting 38th of where he's priced at. Is there someone in this field that we look at ownership and you say, you know what, I just think that driver's just being under-owned today?
It's not pretty, similar to Stenhouse, but Bubba Wallace, $83 starting in 16th place. Actually a good plate racer. He's kind of like Stenhouse, where there's a lot of times where he's just not finishing races and pretty disappointing overall. But if you're looking at the last 2 super speedway races, he's finished first and second, albeit he did win off a rain delay. But just specifically at Daytona, we're talking 2 top 5s, 4 top 15s, 5 top 20s out of the past 6 races. Again, he's in that dead spot where no one wants to roster these guys starting like 12th to 18th, because it's just a dead spot where they don't offer you too much PD upside. And they also offer you a lot of downside. And a lot of these guys can be very up and down drivers. So just kind of like living in this range in tournaments paired with some maybe more chalky drivers in the back, I think is a great way to try to make some maybe potential million maker lineups.
What's your thoughts, Phill?
Yeah, I hate to say it, but Chris took the guy right out of my mouth. It's Bubba, like, because of the similar price. Like, if people really are worrying too much about salaries, then Bubba kind of is that natural pivot off of both Dillon and Almirola. But he's not going to offer you too much place differential upside. But Bubba really is a guy that could go out and try to get himself a victory. I mean, in the last super speedway race that we saw at Talladega, Bubba went out there, made the proper move before the rain got out there, got himself in first, and the race was called, and he was named the victor. Bubba could easily do that again. You look at his track history here. I mean, he has run pretty strong here, and even when you go back to his days at Richard Petty Motorsports, he ran exceptionally well here, despite the equipment. So yeah, in this area, Bubba's the one that continues to catch my eye for 150 builds as that guy in the teens that can still find a top 6 score because he can get you a top 3 finish.
I mean, I threw out the crazy thought process of, if you want to get different from the field, you try to get away from Denny Hamlin. We all know he's going to be Chalk City here today, but a point got brought up in chat saying, hey, so if you do decide to get away, what is the pivot from Denny Hamlin? Who are you pivoting to? Is it someone that are you looking at? Maybe it's an Austin Dillon. Obviously, he's got a ton of ownership, or is it maybe somebody else you're looking at?
So if we're talking like just specifically in the price range, Chase Elliott's right there. But if you're looking for more of a PD pivot instead of just kind of like going all the way up top with the guy like Elliott starting 11th, you have a slew of drivers here. Joey Logano starting in 20th, although he will be decently chalky, not quite as Hamlin. But the two I'm landing on a lot is William Byron and Kevin Harvick. I'm basically viewing them as pretty much the same play. They're priced right around each other. They're starting right around each other. And both these guys have similar upside to Hamlin. Now, they don't have quite the PD upside, but if something happens to Hamlin and these guys stay clean, then you have really great leverage on the field.
I think something we should mention is when we do these shows, there's a particular word that pretty much majority of races comes up. And that word has not been mentioned once here today on the show. And it's that D word, dominators. Guys, kind of explain to people, because I'm seeing some comments in chat of how many dominators you want to have in your lineup, of why dominators is not something we're discussing.
Well, basically the difference here at a plate race is that you can't project fast laps. They're going to be completely random throughout the field, and fast laps are worth nearly double the amount that laps led are, and laps led are even pretty random as well. I mean, typically the same guys are up front dominating: Ryan Blaney, Joey Logano. In the past, Keselowski. I wouldn't surprise if he led some laps today, Denny Hamlin. But the thing is, they're interchanging the entire time. We're not going to see a driver pull away, lead 100+ laps like Kyle Larson did pretty much every single race last year. That wasn't a plate race. And again, the fast laps being completely random as everyone's drafting really takes dominators out of the equation. We have a lack of laps, and the wrecks, it just doesn't make sense to want to worry about dominator points whatsoever in this race. It's nice to have guys that lead laps for you if they can finish the race, but it's definitely not something you should really consider when building lineups today.
What's your thoughts, Phill?
Yeah, when you get down to dominator points, the thing that we kind of worry about the most are the fastest laps, because they're worth nearly twice as much as a laps led point. We're talking about 0.45 for a fastest lap versus a quarter of a point for a laps led, and the fastest laps time and time again that get scattered just randomly throughout the field. I mean, it literally can be the driver out front, or it can be the 16th driver in line. It's just at the mercy of the way that the drivers are going through the draft. And then you've got this weird scenario where if you're really only earning dominator points by getting laps led, that tally can easily be negated by losing place differential. Just say, for example, that Kyle Larson, like you're just going to say, okay, I'm going to play Kyle Larson regardless. I don't care. He's going to lead that first segment, and that's all I'm worried about. Okay, well, you're gonna get the 50 laps led, and that's going to convert itself into 12.5 bonus points for laps led. Well, what happens when he finishes 13th in the race? Well, suddenly that negative place differential has negated, leading a quarter of the race. So when it comes down to it, it's so, I don't want to say it's so much easier, but it's a better thought process to just not worry about these scenarios with these drivers up front who have to make their hay via the laps led points, where it's safer, and we can more viably get the points that we're really looking for via the drivers with place differential and finishing position upside.
Appreciate the super chat from Michael Hammer saying, any difference in lineup building on FanDuel with the different scoring, or is it still stacked the back? I know, Chris, you mentioned this a little bit earlier, how it is a difference between whether you're playing on DraftKings or FanDuel.
Yeah, the scoring is definitely different. And I think you'll notice more of a difference when we're at a different track. Because for the most part, like we said, pricing is not much of an issue today. And when I was comparing my exposures, they're nearly identical on DraftKings and FanDuel today. So I don't think it should look too much different.
What's your thoughts over there, Phill?
Yeah, Chris alluded to this earlier, is that, because place differential points get knocked in half, it does necessarily put a bigger emphasis on the finishing position points. So in that case, I will open up my tournament lineups going up a little bit further up the grid, worrying about finishing position points, because, quite frankly, like, let's just take, for example, BJ McLeod or Jacques Villeneuve. If they pick up 10, 15 spots, that's fantastic, but they're still only finishing around 25th place, and then you give them an additional 7.5 points for place differential. You're still talking about a score that's not going to be top 10, probably not even top 15.
Yeah. Of course, this is the also NASCAR Live for Lock show. We are sponsored by Prize Picks. Be sure to play over at Prize Picks. And when you sign up, deposit, and play at Prize Picks, you'll get 1 free month of also plus platinum. When you sign up there, you see it there at the top right-hand corner of the screen. Of course, also be sure to use that promo code Awesemo for instant first match deposit of up to $100. And I mentioned at the beginning of the show that there were some props that the guys liked over there. First off, I know that each Chris and Phill liked on the laps led. They like the unders in both of these situations. First off, I mentioned about at the beginning of the show about on Prize Picks, you got to look over these lines earlier in the week. And Chris brought up the point of the Brad Keselowski laps led line. You could have got a much better number earlier on this week.
Yeah, I was when they posted the Prize Picks props, I was mainly looking at the fantasy score. Then I ventured over to the laps led, and I saw Keselowski at 26 laps led, which again, it could be a little bit more hit or miss each super speedway race, but just on average, Keselowski's averaging like 5 to 6 laps led per race here at Daytona the past 6 races, and then even adding in Talladega, a track that he's really good at and can definitely get up front and dominate. We're talking 6 to 7 laps led per race, past 12 super speedway races in general. So I mean, just in the law of averages, this is a pretty good bet in my opinion. It's still at 18.5 now, which is definitely not the value you had. He lost about 8 laps there, but I still like, he's no longer with Penske. That's something you got to keep in mind too. Penske is the team that typically dominates up front. So it's not like he can just team up and be buddy-buddy with Joey or Blaney anymore.
And Phill, I know on the lap sled, the other one that's listed there, Kyle Larson at 24.5. And you're just like Chris, or you like the under?
Yeah, I'm following the trends. I mean, when I saw this number, I thought, I wonder. So I went to the race sheets, I looked at the lap sled data page, and we've got 18 races from 2013 through 2021 here. And looking at the pole sitter, that 24.5, that was a number that only 6 out of 18 pole sitters were able to hit in those previous Daytona races. So once again, going back to the law of averages, if that was only a 33% hit rate, and that's something that hasn't happened since 2019, I'm going to take the wild stab, especially with the Fords all behind Larson, that number falls short.
And when we look over at the fastest laps, Ryan Blaney 4.5. And I know, Chris, this is one that you looked at here, and you believe the over is the correct side on this one.
It is tough to project fast laps. I think this one is more on Phill, but I do know the viewpoint he's thinking, where Ryan Blaney's the guy that can definitely get up front and control the field. The thing is, though, fast laps, you can't really project them like we were talking about. So personally, for me, the fast laps are a little bit tougher to trust. Now, he was at 6.5 earlier in the day, I think last night as well. So now that he's at 4.5, I do actually think there is some value there, because there is guys that can easily hit over 6 in a race.
Mm-hmm. Phill, what was your thought process on the over there?
Yeah, I took a stab looking at last year's loop data from the Daytona 500, and it's almost crazy. It looks like Prize Picks actually looked this themselves to set this number, because 6 was kind of like the average for a bunch of the top guys. So if 6 is kind of the baseline for these drivers with top tier equipment, top tier talent, then it makes sense to me that Blaney, should easily be able to hit at least 6.5, and especially if those Fords really do have the horsepower advantage that the garage says that they do.
Before we get into the lower tier salary drivers here today, I do want to mention a comment that Jacob had mentioning about, someone who's in this mid range. He's 7,600 over on DraftKings, 8,000 on FanDuel, and that is Christopher Bell. And Jacob saying no one is talking about him.
I think it's mainly just because he's in that dead range that we keep talking about, because Christopher Bell does not offer you much upside with the starting position. I don't hate him. I mean, I know the equipment's good, obviously, in a Joe Gibbs car. It's just the problem is starting in 12th place, for him to be optimal, he's going to definitely have to sneak inside that top 5. And even then, it might not always be enough, just depending on how the race plays out. So if you're playing Christopher Bell, you're really banking on a top 3 finish, potentially a win. And for me, it's just in that range. You can get a guy like Justin Hayley. Earlier in the day, I like Daniel Hemrick a lot more. Maybe that gets more evened out now with him having to do a pass-through penalty. You have Tyler Reddick starting a little bit further back. I think that's similar upside to now. So he is getting overlooked, and I don't think ownership's going to be too high on him. So I do understand if you want to get some leverage there in tournaments.
Something I will note about FanDuel, it locks here in 24 minutes from now. Their big contest is 98% filled. So if you're going to want to get in that FanDuel contest, that big one over there is $100,000 for first place. You better head there now and start lining them up, because there is less than 1,000 entries are still left in that one. So if you want to get over there, you got to do that right now. But just kind of wanted to know, while DraftKings does have a lock just after 3 o'clock East Coast time, the lock on FanDuel is now in 24 minutes from now. So just something I wanted to throw out there. Now, when we talk about our low tier salary drivers over here, and basically, everyone that's under 7,000, we talked a little about Chase Briscoe. Of course, him going to the rear, initially starting out. We talked a little about Cole Custer earlier on in the day. Noah Gragson, I know that's a guy you guys both talked about yesterday because, well, he's starting 39th.
Yeah, he's basically a free square in cash games. I think in tournaments, you have some excellent pivots here, like in Ty Dillon, Corey Lejoy. But if you're playing cash games today, he has virtually zero downside here. I mean, the worst he can really do, if Noah Gragson was the first guy that wrecked out, he scores 0 points. I mean, compared to anybody showing up front, in front of him, talking like massive, like negative points. So as far as cash goes, Noah Gragson's the guy you're definitely looking at today.
In terms of the rest of this field here, Phil, as you look down below, we would always kind of play the game. How low can you go? How low do you want to get today?
Well, quite frankly, I mean, everybody technically should be in your player pool, because there is a path to each and every one of these guys ending up with definitely a top 10 score, and possibly even a top 6 score. Now, what do they have to do? Of course, it's survive the carnage. And the second thing that they've got to do is they've got to push themselves into a top 15. One of the things that I found when I was doing research for the Millionaire Maker article is that if your guy, regardless of where he starts, if he doesn't at least get you into the into the top 15 with his finish, then he's not going to be a top 6 scorer. So if you're going to play the likes of McLeod, Villeneuve, I add Cody Ware into this, not because he's got better equipment than both of those guys, but still, his super speedway history, it's kind of lacking, and I still kind of have questions about his talent here in the Cup Series. Kaz Gralla, probably more talented than Cody Ware, but we've got the equipment issue that we're wondering about. It all boils down to, do you legitimately believe that these guys can get you a top 15 finish? And if the right scenarios happen, I think it's possible. They're guys that you probably can feel a little safe leaving out of your 20 max and definitely your 3 max builds. But once you get into that 150 range, they're guys that you should be taking small dabs at, just in case worst case scenarios happen.
A question we got about a driver in this range is Ross Chastain. He's starting 19th, 6,700 over on DraftKings, 7,200 on FanDuel. Chris, I'll go to you first on your thoughts about Ross Chastain.
I'm doing Chastain as like the cheaper version of Stenhouse in this race, where they're both starting right beside each other, and they both can be a bit aggressive, and it could be a bit more of like a wreckers or checkers situation. But Ross Chastain actually has a pretty solid history at Daytona. Now, a lot of these numbers come back from the days where he was in junk equipment, so he just ride around the back, let everyone wreck, and then grab his good finish. That is no longer the case now. He's actually in some pretty solid car, but I don't mind Ross Chastain here. Last year at Daytona, he finished in 7th place for the 500 and 18th in the second race. And I know he's starting 19th, so he didn't get a ton of upside there, but he's a guy where if he stays clean, there's serious top 10 potential here, and the ownership shouldn't be too high because, again, he's in that dead zone where no one wants to roster those kind of drivers.
Is there anyone, Phil, in this range that you look at and say, you know what? Yeah, I really don't want to get to that driver.
Oh God, really, unless they're starting in the top 10 down in this area, then they really are somebody that I can tell myself a story. I can make a weird scenario or case. Like when we talk about a Chase Briscoe, like legitimately, you need him to just get super aggressive, fight his way to the front, get some laps led, because he just really does not have that much place differential upside that he can take advantage of. So necessarily, he's got to do something in terms of laps led, and I really don't know if he's going to force that issue. And the same thing with Harrison Burton. Now we're talking about a rookie in the 21 car who, if he knows what's good for him, he's going to mind his P's and Q's and use his first cup race as a way to not make his name mud for the rest of the season. So really with kind of all of these guys down here, there is a story to be told unless they are starting in the top 10. In that scenario, you're probably safe marking them out of your lineups.
So let's say someone wants to place a wager on this race today. In terms of who are the drivers that you're kind of, someone just says, you know what, I just want to make a bet on this guy to win the race. I want to cheer on one guy. And is there someone that's odd you look at? We talked a lot about Ryan Blaney seeing plus 1,200 to win the race. Maybe you think Kyle Larson. We've talked about not a great DFS play because he started on the pole, plus 900 to win this race. Chris, what's your thoughts on the betting side?
I think I'm fully bought in on the Blaney now with the news that it's Penske's birthday, thanks to Phill. I think he's got me too bought in on Blaney right now. I'm going to have to limit myself on up in my Blaney exposure. But yeah, I like Blaney to win the race. I think any of the Penske cars are, well, maybe not Cindric, but Ryan Blaney, Joey Logano. I mean, they're chalk picks, but outside of that, it's going to be pretty much random if it's not one of the big favorites, because it's just going to be on who's in the right place at the right time at the end of the race.
What's your thoughts, Phill, on the betting side of this race?
When I did my first betting article for this race, the easy pick was Denny Hamlin. He's won this event 3 times. He just continues to rack up top 5, show that he's one of the better, if not probably the best super speedway racer in the series currently. If people are looking for some long odds, let me sell you, oddly enough, on Cole Custer. As I'm looking here at the race sheets, a number that I've been able to add into the sheets this year, when looking at past races, is where a driver was, their position in the last 10% of a race. And if we look at the last 10% of the race at the 2 Daytona races and the 2 Talladega races, what do I find? Well, Cole Custer was holding the 4th best average position out of everybody in today's field at 10th place. You've got Harvick at 8.3. Then you've got Brad at 8.8. You've got Christopher Bell at 9.3. And then there's Cole Custer sitting there at 10th, just waiting to kind of make a strike towards the end. So for DFS, if you're looking to try to sell yourself on Custer and you're worried about him not being that good, that should give you some hope. Like in those races last year, he put himself in a winning position, but sometimes things just didn't work out. And if he's in that situation this year, I mean, those are some pretty good odds, because we're talking about 50-1 on DraftKings Sportsbook, 66-1 over at BetMGM. I mean, those are much better odds than what either book is giving you on some of these front runners like Blaney or Hamlin.
Got 15 minutes here left in the show. Of course, we're going to answer your questions, so leave those in chat. I'll get to those as we start to kind of wrap up this edition of the Awesemo NASCAR Live Before a Lock show. Of course, be sure to give us a thumbs up. We do appreciate that. And of course, you're not subscribed to also do that as well. A ton of great shows for you each and every day. And of course, we've mentioned that there's going to be a lot of people that this may be their first time ever playing NASCAR DFS. And so, Craig kind of mentioning about he's a new player. He says, so is Logano a bad play now on FanDuel with this new news? And there was another question. Basically, he goes on saying about how he's confused about starting from the back and all this. For that new NASCAR player, Chris, kind of just explain what this all means in terms of a fantasy perspective.
So in terms of drivers going to the back?
Yeah.
Yeah. So at other tracks, that would matter a little bit. But the way it's going to be scored, some people get the idea that if a driver goes to the back after qualifying, that they have a new qualifying spot, which makes them like the best play in the slate. They're going to hold their original spot. So Joey Logano being scored in 20th, that will not change. Yes, he is going to the rear, but we knew that earlier in the week heading into this. So this is not like new shocking news to us. So we were prepared for that. And it's not changing our thought process on it, because a track like Daytona, some of these guys go to the back on purpose just because they know they can work their way back up, because that's the safest place in the back. That's why we are stacking the back. So some of the drivers are even using their own stack to back strategy, but it's not really an issue with the guy going to the back. It shouldn't worry you, especially at a track like this. Other tracks, yes, but Daytona's fine.
Phill, what's your thoughts on Corey Lejoy?
God, don't get me started on Lejoy. I think he's replaced my fandom for Tyler Reddick. And I mean, you remember just how hot and heavy I was about Reddick. I don't know if I've got room to put a Lejoy fat head behind me here on the wall, but Lejoy is the guy that is just criminally underappreciated at super speedway races. He continues to start in the 20s, kind of all over the place in the 20s, but he'll find his way into the top 10, into the top 15 on a pretty consistent basis. Like, I don't know what his ownership is going to look like, because he's just after like what should be the much chalkier guys of Logano and Harvick and Byron. He doesn't offer you the place differential upside of a guy like Cole Custer or David Reagan or Gralla or Gregson or the much chalkier guys like Dylan and Almirola. But I think that he still has the amazing potential to race his way into the top 10. You've got, go back to last year, him and teammate Jamie McMurray, who did a one-off race for Spire in the 77. They both finished their evenings in the top 10. And like, if you're looking for a team stack to put into your rosters, I have a lot of Spire stacks featuring Lejoy and Castle. I think that these two could really work together and both end their days in the top 10.
One of the things that people are always going to debate on, and it's just isn't a NASCAR equation, this is every sport, is how much money do you want to leave on the table? Chris, there was a comment saying, is leaving $3,000 on the table okay?
I'm leaving more money on the table in my cash game lineup than $3,000. That is totally fine today. It's actually something you would really want to do at a track like this. There's been some instances where we're talking like $20-some thousand on the table in the optimal lineup.
Phill, what is your thoughts today when it comes to how much money to leave on the table?
Yeah, the salary cap, it's something that, like, I know it's tough for people, because generally when you're building NFL, PGA, NBA, whatever the sport is, if you've got more than $500 left over in your roster on DraftKings, you start thinking, man, surely I can make a pivot somewhere and get a little more upside. And that's definitely a conversation that we'll have next week at Fontana. But for this week, because we're not worried about dominator points, we're still just worried about finishing position and place differential. The salary cap is just kind of one of those arbitrary things that kind of it goes out the window. Don't put any concern on it. If you've got a bunch of money left over, if you've got thousands, if you've got tens of thousands of dollars, it's just a factor that really is not going to impact things today.
Someone asked about the weather situation, so I just went over to weather.com. Basically, very, very low chance of rain today. At least 2% in the afternoon, 5% in the evening. So very low chance of rain here in Daytona Beach here. Next, Justin Hayley. I believe we talked about him in the pre-show a little bit, but what is your thoughts on him, Chris?
Overall, I do like him quite a bit. He's a great plate racer. He's with colleague who tends to have some pretty good looking cars. Not cosmetically, maybe cosmetically, but they tend to look pretty good at super speedways in terms of getting pretty good finishes. And Justin Hayley, it's a smaller sample size, but he has an average finish of 7th here. That's when he was in some pretty lesser equipment back in the day. He did have a win at Daytona it was range shortened. So kind of like similar to Bubba Wallace when he won his super speedway race, but he still puts himself in pretty good position. And I'll let Phill talk about the Big Brain Galaxy move he was talking about in the pre-show about with Hemrick going to the back.
Yeah, don't let me scare anybody off. This is just something to consider, because like, I've been throwing around so many different scenarios in my head, because we really don't know how this race is going to play out, with this being the first kind of real race with the Gen 7 car. Like, whatever you thought you learned from the Busch Clash, just throw that out the window. We are in a completely different wilderness now. But the scenario that I was wondering about is Hayley's teammate is Hemrick, and we know that Hemrick's going to have to do the pass through. And with Hemrick being all by himself, I worry about the scenario where Hayley has team orders to fall back to help pick up his teammate and then try to push his way forward. Now, do we have any certainty that this is going to happen? No, this literally is just one of those galaxy brain scenarios. And if it plays out, then by God, I'm not watching any more of the race. I will disappear for the next 5 hours. But just, it's something to keep in mind, but don't anticipate it happening.
No, I'm with you on that one. It's just kind of starting to run some additional crunches, and yeah, a lot of Denny Hamlin, coming up. I mean, that to me is like the question. I think we all kind of have this is like, what is too much Denny Hamlin? If I'm playing a 150 max, like, are you trying to set your exposure to 60%?
So if he's going to be theoretically 60% owned, which is right around where we have him, and I personally like being a little bit overweight on that. Some people are going to go underweight, but I just think he's a good play. I'll just be underweight on the guys up front, and I'll just allocate my ownership to all the good plays and be overweight instead of just being even on the field. So if he's going to be 60%, I don't mind being maybe a little bit over that. Because again, super speedway, you never want to have like 80, 90% of a guy because of the high volatility. But I'm personally taking an overweight stance on Denny tonight.
Are you in the same situation, Phil? Are you going to take the overweight stance?
Oh, no, I actually, people are going to scoff at me, not being crazy with my ownership, but the highest that I ended up going was with Hamlin at 45%. And even that, like, it still feels a bit much for a super speedway race, but like the ceiling, the potential, just the consistency of Hamlin, he was the guy that was worth taking the big stab on. So, I think really for lineup construction, it comes down to this: is first off, if you're starting off your rosters with Hamlin, Dillon, and Almirola, you have got to start doing something different with those final 3 roster spots, because it is going to be so duplicated. It's going to blow your mind. Like those final 3 spots, you've got to make very contrarian selections in order to get away from that chalk. So either you just totally embrace the chalk, you just say, whatever, these guys have the potential, they should, outside of alien abductions or getting sent into the fence like Mike Snyder last night, these guys should come through. So I'm going to find my different path with the other guys. Or you just say, yeah, I'll have my 40 to 45, even 50% of these guys, but I'm going to make sure that I don't try to include them all in the majority of my lineups so that I can avoid duplicate lineups.
In a 1v1 situation, because this got question I got asked a little while ago, comparing 2 drivers who are very similarly priced, there's a $600 difference between them: Joey Logano versus Kevin Harvick.
And again, I think it comes down to what Phil was just talking about. What's the rest of your lineup look like? If you're really chalky, Hamlin's going to be higher owned than Harvick by a decent margin. They're both very similar plays. So again, if we need the lower owned guy, I'm going Harvick. If your lineup is decently contrarian up, I don't mind just getting right to Joey, even though he's going to have some pretty high ownership. I mean, he's grading out very well for me. And like we said earlier, I mean, Joey is one of the best drivers here. But Kevin Harvick is good as well. So again, it just comes down to your roster construction. But Joey heads up for me.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about roster construction there, and Phil just kind of going off what you were just talking about, like if I'm building a cash lineup, I think, there may be people who say, you know what, I'm just gonna, I've got the DraftKings app open. Okay, I've clicked Denny Hamlin, I've picked Grayson, and then I'm going from there. So I've got my high end option, I got my low end option. Now I just build the rest of my lineup based from there. And of course, Chris, you mentioned it earlier. You take a guy like Grayson, there's starting 39th. There's like no downside to this equation, especially in cash.
Exactly. And that's why it just comes down to exactly how we're constructing these lineups, because again, with the high volatility, these guys in the back, while they're not the most exciting plays, and you don't think they have the highest ceilings because you never really see it at other races, it's a completely different animal here. And it's what works. If you look at the optimal lineups year after year, you see the same reoccurring thing.
The other thing, we talked about this a little bit earlier, just to mention some people that maybe are checking in right now about Hemrick. Of course, we know, failed inspection 3 times, passed on the 4th time. There'll be a pass time. Phil, you just talked about maybe a potential scenario with getting some help there, but What would be your advice be to everyone listening right now of what to do with Hemrick in terms of how many lines do you want to put him in?
Okay, personally, for me, I was sitting at somewhere around 25 to 30% ownership on Hemrick. Like he's in a good colleague car. He's an experienced super speedway racer. It shouldn't be that tough for him to pick up 15, maybe even 20 spots should he not wreck. Well, this whole scenario of him having to do the pass through penalty while everybody else is taking the green flag, basically being the only car by himself, trying to punch a hole through dirty air while everybody else is in the pack together. As the draft goes on, it really does hurt his possibilities that he's going to get a lap down, maybe even two, and that he's going to be in one of these really odd holes where he can't get out of this hole where he's down a few laps, and that really does impact his ceiling, because if he's stuck in 36th 37th place, a couple of laps down, he needs a couple of ensuing wrecks in order to be the guy that gets the lucky dog and get himself back on the lead lap. So if you're going to play Hemrick, like I lowered my ownership. I know Chris said at the beginning of the show that he lowered his ownership. If you are playing Hemrick, I think you're doing it with the idea that he's going to get that lap back if he does get lapped, which I think we're all kind of assuming that he does. He's going to get that lap back early, and then he's gonna race, and everything will be fine. And I would bet that since that news, that a lot of people have been lowering their ownership because they're worried about the same thing that we're worried about. So if you play Hemrick, you assume that he's going to get that lap back, and you're also trying to take advantage of an ownership discount now.
Try to get a couple more questions here before we get out of here. T-Strack saying fading Hamlin in single entries automatically make you different enough.
In single entry, yes, that'll be good enough, because just simply getting off a guy that's going to push for 60+% ownership in a single entry, depending on what size you're in, I mean, that's just insane leverage to start.
Malcolm asking, mentioning about his core of Hamlin, Custer, and Byron for DraftKings. Your thoughts on that, Phill?
Yeah, I like that. Of course, Hamlin, we've talked, he's definitely got the capability to win this race, probably lead laps in the process, get you if nothing else, get you a top 5 finish. Like he doesn't even have to lead laps, and he'll get you a top 5 finish and still have a top 6 DraftKings score. Custer, I've been talking about his upside. If he can get you a top 10, there's a really good chance that he'll get you a top 6 score. Byron is the wild card. Chris was talking about him yesterday in the strategy show, and how those results have been rather lacking. So you're just kind of hoping that Byron keeps it together, stays with the rest of the Chevys. And yeah, he starts 23rd. He's got place differential upside. I think at that starting position, you're probably going to need him to finish somewhere in the neighborhood of 6th or better, but he's definitely capable of pulling that off.
I'll finish my last comment. If you are new on NASCAR DFS, don't get discouraged if we're 20 laps into the race based on where you're at standing wise. Pretty much when I check my entries, the only thing I'm looking at is what is the ownership in terms of this. So in terms of monitoring how you're doing it in terms of these GBPs, don't worry about that till the end of the race, because a lot of things could change at any bit of moment. Guys, some final thoughts from both of you. We'll start with you, Phill.
I'm going to put an exclamation point on that. Put your phone away, close the laptop, turn off the desktop. Do not keep track of your current winnings. That is the worst thing that you can do for your blood pressure. You will see wild swings, and especially if you're one of these people that had the bankroll to max the Millionaire Maker, I imagine that sucker is going to go through a bunch of wild swings, especially depending on green flag pit strategy. So do yourself a favor. Yes, watch the race, but do not keep track of what that current winnings is.
For you, Chris, any final thoughts?
Just to carry on that, Phill makes a great point. You shouldn't check, but unlike Phill, I have to check. I'm going to check. I know some people are going to do it. So, what my advice would be on that is, you should probably be wanting to lose money for the majority of the race until there's a big wreck. If you are losing money until then, you're probably in the right spot. If you are winning money early on, good chance you're not going to be winning money later on in the race. So if you're like me and you have to check because you can't not look at it, That's how I tend to go through it. Don't get too up or down. Just kind of stay normal and just hope you're losing money until there's a big wreck.
We'll end on a super chat from Christian Smith. Any love for Eric Jones?
I've been known in the past to tout Eric Jones a lot. Starting in 13th, he's actually a good plate racer. I know the equipment's not what it used to be in the Joe Gibbs car, but it doesn't really matter much. He's had some solid runs in his new car now with Petty. But starting in 13th, he's in that spot where no one wants to click on Eric Jones. I can see him being in the single digits in terms of ownership, maybe push like low tens. But he's actually a decent turn play because even though he's not the guy you think of being able to be a top 5 finisher, he could sneak in there.
Phill,
final things on Eric Jones?
Yeah, his path to being optimal, it's tough because he's got a hair of place differential that he can gain, but you really, because of what he doesn't have to gain place differential wise, you are really kind of needing a top 4 finish from him.
And that is going to wrap it up for the Awesemo NASCAR Live Before Lock show. Good luck to everyone today here for the Daytona 500. Of course, we'll be here every Sunday for Live Before Lock. So as the show ends, be sure to hit that thumbs up button if you have not. And we will talk to you next week on the Awesemo NASCAR Live Before Lock show. Have a good day, everybody.